Creating something like this might seem overwhelming. You might not even know where to start with a scene this complicated. But just like in the last video, we're going to start simple and move more complex. So really this is the first step. I get sort of a 3-point perspective grid and draw my general shell. This is the bounding box that sort of tells me where the street is. You can see the side faces of this plane as sort of the sides of the street. These are going to be the shop fronts. The bottom face is the street itself. And really, this is the same kind of drawing that you could make an interior space if you wanted. Maybe we're standing in a long hallway right now. This is the beauty of working in perspective. As soon as you understand these rules, describing volume and form is pretty straightforward. So to start working on my street scene, I'm going to first just start doodling around until I reach that moment where I find the shell. Because a lot of times when I do a drawing like this, I don't necessarily know what it's going to look like at all. I'm just sort of working in 3D space, and sometimes something will just sort of pop out. And here I've pretty much got it. Once I erase away a little, this shape is going to be my shell. This is really no different than the last video where we looked at drawing objects and vehicles. This shell is going to be sort of the anchor for the rest of my image. It's going to give me a good sense of space, and then I can begin to start detailing relative to that shape. And you'll find that once you have a shape like this, doing the rest of the details becomes easier and easier. Once you begin to have more and more lines correctly drawn in perspective, each following line just becomes quicker and easier to draw. It's kind of cool. Your drawing sort of gets this momentum, and as you fill it out more and more, you're really just adding details in a 3D space. You're not so much thinking about perspective anymore. So sometimes I'll really refine a bit more on the shell here before I extend out into the rest of the scene. This is just sort of getting mentally prepped, falling into this 3D space, and really getting ready to start designing the rest of it. And it can be hard to explain this thought process, because really I'm just following the rules we talked about extensively in Perspective Sketching Part 1. I'm doing the same rules over and over. Basic operations, basic forms, follow perspective rules. But once I've internalized those rules enough, I can just begin drawing a space, thinking in 3D. So I'm doing the same cutting and trimming and rounding as I was in those drawings of the sci-fi vehicles. But here, instead of a single object, I'm constructing an entire environment. So I'm doing quite a bit of freehand drawing. I'm also using the click, shift, click method, all the tools we've talked about in the past. But again, these techniques are only possible once you've really gotten the rules down. Then you just get to have fun thinking of these fantastic sci-fi spaces. It's really kind of exciting. Just like the truck and the tent from the last video, all I'm doing now is I'm going to add a little rendering, a little polish, and I can turn this into a final image. But believe me when I tell you, this is much easier to make a painting like this if you've taken time to do a nice, solid underdrawing. However long it took me to make that nice, strong perspective drawing underneath is time saved. Making a painting like this can really be a nightmare if you don't have a good foundation. Okay, you might be thinking, well, that's fine and good, but what if I don't want to do sci-fi? What if I want to do something with trees and a stream, maybe a sort of a little bubbling brook going underneath a bridge in the forest? There's not a lot of angles there. Do the same techniques apply? Well, they do. Once again, we're going to start with sort of the key shape in the illustration. And you know something else? This time I'm not even going to use a grid. Now this might seem scary, but again, once you get used to these general techniques in perspective, something changes. You just have a better sense of thinking in 3D. Once you've drawn enough cubes on a grid, you can draw a cube from scratch. So here I've got a good basic shape, and I want to start detailing this out into my shell. Now, since this is going to be a bridge, it needs to have a big curve, and that's going to be sort of a primary shape in my composition. The rest is just following those perspective rules we talked about in the first series. But now here we are. Here's the shell. But unlike in the previous example, the shell is not surrounded by the 3D grid. So now I just have to make sure that I draw perspective lines that are correct relative to this shell. So using lines that are parallel, for instance. As long as they stay parallel and recede to the vanishing points correctly, I can't go wrong. But since I'm doing rocks and stones, they're just not going to be as exacting. So this is an example where I might not want to use the grid. I want to have some natural randomness. This is a forest after all. So the bridge is going to be the most rigid part of the scene. The rest is going to be a little less rigid. And once you get used to doing perspective, having this play between organic and rigid becomes a little easier. You get a sense for when to freehand something and when to correctly use the vanishing points. So adding in these bushes and trees can be pretty rough. But then as I begin to finalize this, I'm going to want to make sure certain angles are very exact. So here I'm making sure this arch is correct. And I missed it a little bit on the sketch, but I'm going to get it just right on the final ink. Because this line, it's going to be very obvious if I've messed this up. So I'm going to start working in layers here, using the temp layers that I like to use so much. And I'll just begin refining the image. Because I've sort of laid down a nice understructure for the drawing, and it's going to be hard to mess up at this point. The perspective of this space is pretty well established. So now I just get to have fun and add in little details. And these little details are even easier to add in for organic objects because they just don't have to feel so rigid and perfect. This is definitely a situation where I would look at some reference of actual forests, maybe see what actual rocks look like, because that's going to just add to the general realism of the image. But you can see here that this image is in perspective. If I add a little shading and form to it, it really stands out as a rigid perspective image. But it's got the great qualities of looseness and organic that you'd want to have in a forest. So I'm still using mainly the same rules, but allowing myself to freehand for some of the imagery. And I didn't even need to start with a grid. The most important point, though, about this whole idea is that the rules are the same. Drawing an object or drawing a scene, you're still following the same perspective rules. All the rules tell you is how to depict space. What subject matter you use doesn't really matter. So as long as you can internalize the basic perspective rules, you can draw whatever you want.